Good evening and welcome all of you. Normally the honors for the opening comments is done by Inakshi Sopti, who is the CEO of the Asia Society India Center. But since she's traveling, she's very smartly delegated upwards to a board member. So I'm only here sort of reading her script. So if I offend anybody, you can just say it was all about Inakshi. But anyway, it's a pleasure to have you join us, and I'm sorry if there are not enough seats. It's nice to see everybody sort of huddling in, being close to each other. My name is Sunil Mehta, and I am a member of the Asia Society India Center Board, and I'm also the chairman of IndusInd Bank Limited. Welcome to the Asia Society's India Center's first program in 2026. We are delighted to begin the new year with a conversation that is grounded in data and looks at the journey of India's unique economic development through the twin imperatives of social transformation and a new model of nation building. The Indian experiment has always been incredibly ambitious in its vision. As Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru reminded us that we awoke to freedom and to responsibility, to the challenges of eliminating poverty, ignorance, disease, and suffering. It has been nearly 8 decades since this extraordinary democratic experiment began, and in that time, India has added more than 1 billion people to its population, or now what is a sixth of global humanity. As Dr. Arvind Subramanian and Dr. Devesh Kapur explore in their new book, which is also lying there, A Sixth of Humanity, India's Development Odyssey, popular narratives around India's development often surprise us. When we examine them and with a closer look, data-focused eye, whether it is India's economic growth after independence or the successes and failures of Indian states. I am delighted to have the authors here to discuss these ideas with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Arvind Subramanian, who was Arvind. You can raise your hand, Arvind. Arvind Subramanian, who was a professor of economics at Ashoka University and the founding director of the Ashoka Center for Economic Policy. He also served as a chief economic advisor to the Government of India between 2014 and 2018 and is currently a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Arvind is very well known. Everybody who followed whenever the economic survey came up before the budget, he was there on NDTV, very explicitly explaining all the nuances of India and its economy. And I must say, Arvind, it was a pleasure to hear you at that point of time about and getting to understand the nuances of India's economic growth, development, and the challenges. And you did an excellent job. We are also joined by Dr. Devesh Kapur, Star Foundation Professor and South Asia Studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. His research focuses on the political and institutional determinants of economic development, and he has previously held appointments at the Brookings Institution, Harvard University, and the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome, Devesh. It's a pleasure to meet you. I hadn't had a chance to meet you earlier, but whatever little time we spent earlier in the evening, thoroughly enjoyable. And our moderator for the evening is Yogita Limaye, the BBC's South Asia and Afghanistan correspondent. Yogita, thank you for being here and taking this responsibility. Her award-winning work focuses on political and humanitarian stories across South Asia, and we are delighted to have her navigate the complexities of this discussion with us tonight. Before I hand this over to Yogita, I would like to thank Jolly's. I must say I've come here for the first time, but it's a wonderful place. The sandwiches were fabulous. Anybody tried the sandwiches? They were really great. So you hear, Mudit is sort of supporting me on that front. Thank you, Jollies. And they are our experienced partner for this program. Quick note of housekeeping. The conversation will run for about 45 minutes, after which we will open it up for the audience for questions. Please ask some really tough questions to both Arvind and Devesh. They will try and moderate their responses, depending on how diplomatic they are going to be this evening, but it's a question of how the audience sort of asks them some piercing questions. Members of the Asia Society team will offer microphones to those who would like to ask a question. Yogita, over to you. Thank you.
So could I invite Dr. Subramanian and Dr. Kapur on stage, please? So thank you very much. I think we're just I think we've entered the second week of the year, but I think I can still get away with saying Happy New Year. And already the first week of the year, oh my God, it's been a wild ride, isn't it? So it's going to be another unprecedented, unpredictable year. It's quite good that we have a discussion that is very much rooted in data, in stuff that you can actually prove and that we already know has happened. I'm going to jump straight into it because there is so much to get into, and I'm aware that people are going to be wanting to ask lots of questions, so I don't want to waste time speaking. I will let you do that. I want to open up with actually what you open the book with. You talk about India being successful in establishing what you call as macro order, of establishing democracy. Of course, pockets of violence, but no mass violence. You refer to it, of course, as a precocious democracy, a democracy ahead of its time. I've also heard it, and this is something I've wondered a lot in my travels as a journalist in India, as a miracle democracy. What is the reason? I mean, there is no reason for this entity to have survived as a single union. There were dire predictions made about how India would split apart. You mentioned in your book as well, notably by Winston Churchill, and yet that didn't happen. What have you found? Why did that not happen? Is it something the leadership did right? Is it something about us as a people?
So, so one of the things.
So there isn't a clicker, but do you want to bring up the first, because we can bring that up? Is it possible for us to control the computer? Yes. Oh, no, what?
Because we can then show.
Yeah, absolutely, so that it's matched to the... So while they bring that over, do you want to... Yeah.
So, usually when you pick up an Indian newspaper, every day you'll see some violence somewhere. And there's a general impression here, and even more so outside the country, that there's a lot of violence in India. Actually, what we show is that in the process of state and nation building, India has been completely exceptional, and I want to emphasize that, in not how much violence there has been, but how little violence there has been. Now, why we focus on that? So, any process of economic development, you must first establish order. Order is a necessary but not sufficient condition for economic, right? I mean, when you go, everyone knows there's not much development in Bihar, and we broadly have a sense that Bihar's order is weak, right? Now, we argue that yes, and we show in the rest of the book that democracy does create challenges, but the one exceptional contribution that the democracy did for India is that it was crucial for state and nation building with very little violence. Historically, state and nation building throughout the world is an extremely violent process, period. And for instance, if you look at the US Civil War, 2% of the population is killed. You apply that to India, that's 35 million people, right? That's the scale. Look at China, we all laud its extraordinary economic achievements. In the 50s and 60s, that's about 50 million people were killed, right? So, and you can take a host of things, what happens with the Soviet Union when it's formed, right? 15, 18 to 20 million people killed. Now, we argue that because India chose a very distinctive path for nation building, the usual path was either built on a single language, a single religion. Or we can go to that one, yeah. But India chose democracy as its key instrument for nation building. And what you see here is that the per capita income at which the franchise begins to expand. So you have basically three models, right? There is the Western model where the franchise expands as per capita income grows. There is the East Asian model where you first have economic development and the franchise follows. There is a third model, which is China. Massive economic development, no franchise. India was so distinctive that it gave universal franchise at very low levels of development. So if you look at this graph, right, and you look at India's per capita income relative to comparator countries, you can see it's a complete outlier, not only at the level of income at which it gives it, but also you can see that the gap between male and female franchise compared to other countries, there's no gap. Now remember, at the time of independence, India was a massively patriarchal society. It still is, but relatively speaking, it was much more so. And so I think it really took us some, a deeper understanding to realize what an exceptional step they took and how much it paid off in ways that we don't quite comprehend, because we don't really realize how much violence, state and nation building that has occurred around the world and how much India sort of avoided that.
So we're in Bombay, and Bombay is the financial capital of the world. So your question about order, right? So it's not just as Devesh said that India avoided extreme political disorder. India also avoided extreme economic disorder. John Maynard Keynes has a famous line, which actually is due to Lenin, and Lenin is reported to have said, there is no surer way of debauching, of debasing or destroying a society than to debauch the currency. I.e., if you have high inflation, basically there's all kinds of societal breakdowns. We don't have that division, unfortunately. And so one of the things we show in the paper is that, if you compare India with all other developing countries, comparable countries, much lower inflation and virtually no episodes of hyperinflation, because it's hyperinflation that basically breaks down society. Now, a corollary of that, because we're in Mumbai, the RBI is here. I always like to believe and think that the job of the governor of the RBI in maintaining low inflation is actually trivial. I'm exaggerating. Is because Indian society, because in a democracy, inflation hurts the poorest the most. So therefore, Indian society wants low inflation. So the governor's job is to basically deliver what society wants. So in that sense, it's not very difficult. In fact, Chidambaram used to have a famous rule which said that, no politician in India wants inflation above 5%. I mean, we've breached that occasionally, but essentially just to say that the counterpart of the avoiding political disorder is also avoiding economic disorder.
So I'm going to read a sentence that I found highly impactful from this part, and it'll take me to my next question. You say the absence of major violence does not equal the absence of chronic fear. For the small enterprise, the prevalence of macro order does not mean the presence of a climate conducive to ongoing entrepreneurial activity. So you've talked about the success. You've said it's a massive success because it was a complex task, in front of our founding government, in front of our first leaders. And yet, actually, you think we shouldn't be that forgiving of them and their policies in the first 30 years after independence. Are you being a little bit unfair? I know you've said you don't want to look back, at the past through the lens of the present, but you've still said we're far too forgiving.
No, so I think, if I'm understanding your question right.
I think there are two parts to the question.
Yeah. One is that we established order, but we did not establish rule of law. And there's a big, one is at a macro level, one is in a sense a micro level issue, right? Can a young woman go out in the night alone in virtually any part of India? That's the basic sort of, that's one very simple test. Do you have a rule of law, right? The absence of fear. Now, we go through this thing and show right from the 50s, every decade there is a big law commission report on court dependencies. There's a report in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s. Nothing changes. The cases simply cumulatively increase, right? And we give a range of reasons why that's the case. But we cannot prove it, but once you see something repeated, that everyone is aware of the problem repeatedly and very little changes, you have to ask why. And I think for much of the political class, it makes strategic sense to keep rule of law weak. Because that weakness allows for much greater rent-seeking behavior, because strong rule of law is a check on that. Now, we can't prove that to you because there's no direct, but this is a sort of imputed from this repeated lack of.
So I think there was a second part to the question about, whether we are forgiving about the past or whether we should be so forgiving. So if you look at the first 30 years, planning and so on, famously, many of your predecessors were part of the Bombay plan and said, and kind of endorsed the model that, our early leaders adopted. So the sense in which we should not, judge them with the condescension of posterity is because, you have to take these things in real time and say, what were the opportunities and the challenges and the limitations that they faced? And more particularly in this case, what was the prevailing zeitgeist of the time? What did most countries at that point do? And there, of course, planning, protectionism, a role for the public sector were all part of, for example, even the West was turning to the state for the welfare state, famously Europe, even the US after the New Deal. The model then people were looking to as a big success was the Soviet Union, and therefore, we followed that. But there's one thing which I think we are less forgiving about in the book is the following, is at that time, everyone believed that we must protect the economy. And that's called import substitution, right? You prevent competition because you want domestic entrepreneurship and domestic, firms to thrive. But what we did was we turned around and said, no, we will stymie the domestic private sector. So in our catalog of the sins of the past, the only one we should be less forgiving about is this whole stymieing and crushing of the private sector via most famously licensing, but also, other onerous regulations on them. Because, and this is not, because if your aim is to say we want to promote domestic production, domestic entrepreneurship, domestic whatever, resilience as it were, with what we call today, why then did you not allow, you only favored the inefficient public sector. So what ended up happening, and this is something we say in the book, is that we think of that era as import substitution, but actually it was an era of scarcity. Why was it scarcity? Foreign supplies were not allowed. Inefficient domestic supply, public sector was favored. Inefficient small-scale supply was favored, and efficient private sector supply was again penalized. So you ended up with a regime of scarcity, and for that we should be less forgiving about.
If I could add, one example just to illustrate. Take something that now we're sort of waking up to, is the need for a much stronger domestic capabilities in defense manufacturing. For half a century, we imported tens of billions of dollars of defense equipment from abroad, but we did not allow our own private sector to enter. Now, what logic would say that you gift your money outside, but you do not allow your own firms to do what you're importing?
So I'm sorry, I'm jumping through things because we don't have that much time. But then you'd say we entered this period of growth, but it was growth, as you call it, without structural transformation. Is that basically you've got a shiny roof on top of this house, but actually the walls, the fundamentals, the foundation is pretty weak?
Yeah.
Is that what you say?
Yeah. So I think that if you look at most successful models of development, right, essentially you have agriculture, then you have This is the one. I don't have the domestic one. So you have the most successful development models. You start with agriculture, lots of people working there. Then there's an agricultural productivity boom, which leads to the rise of manufacturing, especially formal manufacturing, especially labor-intensive manufacturing. And then you do a lot of labor-intensive manufacturing, and then you graduate into high-skilled services. That's the model that Korea, Taiwan, Japan, many other East Asian countries, China most famously achieved. But India skipped from agriculture, still don't do very much formal manufacturing, and we do services. Now, the puzzle is the following, and this is the important part to realize about growth without structural transformation, is that nobody here would even plausibly ask the question of why didn't we get structural transformation in the first 30 years? We didn't because we stymied the private sector, whatever. The puzzle is the following. After 1980, especially after the reforms of 1991, we got rid of most of those things. One. Second, the policies that were holding us back, we got rid of them. Second, India from about 1980 to 2015 was amongst the top 5 or 6 fastest growing economies in the world. So we grew very rapidly, but we had no structural transformation. And the chart here shows you one manifestation of that on the international side. So the chart on the left, what it shows is what is the per capita income of various migrant groups in the United States relative to the per capita GDP of their counterparts back home. And what you see is that Indians living in the US, Indian Americans, have the highest per capita GDP. And basically this has happened because we have exported talent, and that talent has done very well in the US, and that explains this. So that's precocious, you're exporting talent, and the talent is not there. But the flip side to that is this other chart, which I think, at least in my view, is kind of epitomizes India's development failure. On the y-axis, what you have is the share of a country in global exports of low-skilled products. By low-skilled, we mean apparel, textile, clothing, footwear, leather, and more recently even, electronic component assembly and so on. So the y-axis is the share in global export manufacturing. The x-axis, what is your share of the global labor force? You will see China here up there on top, where China has about 20 to 22% of the global labor force and 40 to 50% of global export market. Look at India, 20 similar share of the labor force, 3 to 4% of global market share. So the inability to use trade to boost formal manufacturing, especially low-skill manufacturing, that is the development failure. And one consequence which we don't realize is labor-intensive manufacturing is female labor-intensive manufacturing. In apparel, for example, if you go to, I advise the government of Tamil Nadu, if you go to the Foxconn factory in outside Chennai or the factory in Hosur, for example, they have hostels there because 80% of the labor force is women. And because we didn't do labor-intensive manufacturing, because we underexploited trading opportunities, that is what gave us growth, because of the IT services boomed, but didn't give us structural transformation.
Can I, because I know that some of the things that have surprised you are quite related to this. So can I actually ask you that? But when you started this, we all have our biases. We all have some, we've imagined something, and then you go in and actually the numbers are showing you something else. Can I ask both of you, what is it that you found most surprising?
So the first was the surprise about order and how India was distinctive. A second surprise, I don't know if we have that.
I know where that is. It will be after the fiscal deficit chart. That one, right?
No. So we didn't. It's not there. Damn. A second surprise was if you look at the, just put it on this, otherwise people focus on this. Yeah, put it on the cover, yeah. So, is the structure of the Indian state writ large? So if you look at the three largest countries in the world, United States, China, and India, the United States and China have very different political regimes, but in both of them, they are identical that public employment is maximum at the federal level and at the local level, very little at the state level, which means it's at tier 1 and tier 3, very low in tier 2. India is exactly the opposite. It's maximum in tier 2. So we show that many of India's development failures are in the provision of local public goods. Cities, garbage collection, you don't have enough traffic policemen, the water supply is poor, the local school, the teacher is not, all the things we know about, which are all responsibilities globally of local governments. So the normal conversation in India is, when we say about centralization, it's about centralization in Delhi relative to the states. The real challenge, we argue, is actually the centralization within states of tier 2 vis-a-vis tier 3. India is extremely centralized at tier 2, which is why, of course, India's cities are, let's face it, terrible, right? And we know that cities are the engines of growth for this century. So that was the second surprise. A third surprise was on public enterprises. So we put together for the first time, we believe, a complete set of financials of central public sector enterprises over half a century, and also for much of state-owned enterprises. And then we saw the rate of return relative to, and we estimated the opportunity cost. And you can take the GSEC rate as a benchmark or the prime lending rate as a benchmark. And the cost was staggering. Over half a century, these cost about between 1.5 to 2.5% of GDP every year. To put it in perspective, if the state-owned enterprises had delivered even a modest, reasonable rate of return, each Indian state could have spent double its health expenditure, and the central government could have spent 75% more on infrastructure every year for the last half century. So you can think of. However, this is not in the past. More public sector enterprises have been set up under the Modi government than by the Nehru government. The total investment in central public sector enterprises in the Nehru era was 1 lakh crore in 2024 rupees. In the Modi era was 22 lakh crores. Of course, as a share of GDP, it's less. But there is one big difference. In the first era, it was on manufacturing. In this era, it's on infrastructure. That's the big difference.
So let me tell you two surprises very quickly, and the third we'll take up in the Q&A. So a big question that we always ask is, oh my God, why can't we grow like China? Maybe we have too much democracy. Maybe we should become like China, and all will be well. That's kind of the fantasy that we live in. But here's one surprise that Devesh and I discovered, that it turns out that 1/3 of India, the Indian states, which is the South, the West, and Haryana, grew almost as rapidly as China and for almost as long. So this chart basically starts the clock in 1980 and compares growth rates of the Indian states against all the countries. You will see that 1/3 of India, Tamil Nadu, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Maharashtra, they grow almost as rapidly as a thing. So why this is important, of course, is that our perspective now should not just be, why can't we grow like China, but why can't the remaining 2/3 of India grow like the 1/3 of India that grew like China? So it kind of shifts the perspective on how we should be even thinking about and who we should be benchmarking against. Bombay is a city that believes a lot in fiscal discipline. So this was there are lots of very eminent macroeconomists here. I also pretend to be a macroeconomist. But Devesh and I, when we saw this data, we were stunned because if you start the clock in 1990, for the last 35 years, remember, this is the era of rapid growth in India, where, rapid growth means there should be a lot of taxes, our fiscal situation should be good. It turns out that India has the highest fiscal deficit every year compared to all countries, comparable emerging market countries, and of course, much more than advanced countries as well. India's deficit, state and central government and state governments combined, has averaged something like between 8 to 10 percentage points of GDP. And we're not even adding here, which we show on top, the kind of things from public sector enterprises. So we have had the highest fiscal deficit amongst all the states since 1991. And the explanation we give is that India's democracy, the beauty of Indian democracy is that it accommodates every manner of vested interests. If you look at the tax side, everyone is exempt from paying taxes. If you look at the subsidy side, everyone ends up getting subsidies. So we call this the Kamadhenu fiscal state, like, the Kamadhenu abundantly, indiscriminately giving to everyone. And this is the continued democracy. The consequence of this, and this is, I'll end here, is that we've not had major crisis since 1991, so we've not paid that cost, but the amount of budget that's spent on interest is also the highest in the world, which has crowded out many, many expenditures like defense, development, so on. And so this also came as a big surprise to us.
So actually, I will come back to a question about the states later, but on this specific point, that sounds fiscally precarious. Is it something we should be worrying about?
Oh, absolutely. We should be worrying about this because, these things can easily get out of control. And we should, you see, part of the reason we've been able to sustain this is, one, India has always had a reputation for honoring its obligations. Because the puzzle is, why haven't financial markets penalized India? One reason is that India has always had a good record. So I think markets cut us slack for that reason. The second reason we should worry is that this is sustainable as long as we grow rapidly. If you grow rapidly, you can sustain the debt, as it were. But as soon as growth slips and then there's some external event, I think this starts getting more precarious. And the third, more proximate reason is that in the last few years, we've seen competitive populism, taking hold in India, where I think politicians have got hold of this new toy called cash transfers. And, it started with Andhra Pradesh, went to the center, and it's become like, a toy. You say, Devesh says, I'll give you 1,000 rupees. Then Arvind says he'll give you 2,000 rupees. So the states are outcompeting each other. And this kind of populism, especially if the growth slows down, can be quite precarious.
Can I just ask, because we're talking about growth and growth rates, and one of the things you observe, there is a specific section where you talk about the GDP and its measurement, and you say it's only in the past decade, for the first time, that you've seen political calculation actually affect the methodology of it. That again to me sounds like we don't actually know. We're kind of swimming in the dark. Can we even trust the growth rates? I mean, there's an obsession over it every time, and I blame us in the media for it, that, there's an obsession over, okay, this is the growth rate, this is GDP rate. Are we swimming in the dark here? And honestly, does the GDP growth rate even matter? Shouldn't it, what we'd be worrying about is GDP per capita?
I think, one of the things we wanted to avoid in the book is that there are some issues, if you spend too much time on, it can occupy all the oxygen. And this is a book that is comprehensive, and we want readers to, look at all aspects. However, you cannot ignore the data issue. Firstly, let's be careful, let's be clear here. The data issues are not these days just confined to India. All major economies, China, there was a famous chart in the Financial Times. If you look at how much data they were publishing, it goes up like this, and when Xi takes hold of, comes to power, it comes down like this. The United States today doesn't have good employment data, inflation data, GDP data. So I suspect that something about the turn to illiberalism and majoritarianism and centralization of power, I think this kind of probably goes with the turf. So that's the general thing we should keep in mind. However, in the Indian case, the only thing, we don't want to get into all the, was it political, was it bad, was it good? We just show simply that there are some periods where, if you look at GDP growth rate, especially from 2012 to 2020, GDP growth rate in the boom period and say between 2004 and 2012, India's economy boomed. And all indicators showed, India was just a heady place. Every number you took was growing at double digits. Exports, imports, credit, investment, everything, car sales, everything. After 12, after the change in methodology, what we show is that the GDP growth number remains the same from 11, 12 to 19, 20. But every other indicator that you see, exports collapse, and it doesn't just decline. Take exports, for example. It collapses from 15% in the boom era to about 4% in the post era. Credit, double digit to low single digits. Every indicator declines, and yet the GDP growth rate holds up. So, we don't want to let's not get distracted too much by this, but the point is that, we are a serious country, we are an important country. We should not have a C rating from the IMF on our GDP data. To be fair to the government, I think they're taking this very seriously, and the upcoming revisions of the GDP data should, I think, lead to significant improvement.
I take your point, but because your book is so rooted in numbers, it's rooted in data, if you don't have that in the future, we've had a census which is much delayed. But let me move on from that to a question about the states, because one of the other statements you make in the book is that whatever the central government did badly, the states did worse. Is this even the states that were growing as fast as China? And also, if you can explain what you mean by that.
So, broadly, take a very simple thing. Universities in India, public universities. Compare central public universities with state public universities. Now, central public universities are also declining, but state public universities collapsed for the most part decades ago and are terrible for the most part. We take a host of institutions, right? The Finance Commission, which is formed at the center, the states have the counterparts. And you see states don't form them, they put, retired bureaucrats, they ignore the recommendations. You can compare, say, central electricity like NTPC, compare its performance with, state counterparts. World of difference. So we go through even the election commission. I'm not talking of what the EC is doing now, but for the most part, state election commissions do a much worse job than the National Election Commission. Public enterprises, the state public enterprises are, the central public enterprises, some good, some bad. State public enterprises, there's no some good, some bad. They're all terrible. There's no ambiguity there. So a host of these things we show how much the states do worse. That's the sense in which we...
Yeah, but to reconcile, your question was also that how come, remember how come some states are growing like China, right? So just to be clear, what Devesh said was that if you compare the states as a whole with the center, you get this pathology, right? And just to add, remember the biggest failures in India of education and health were state subjects. And that's something that we should keep in mind. But the other comparison is a within-state comparison. So the two are not inconsistent. On average, especially on these major public good provision, the states do worse than the center. But amongst the states, there is a lot of variation. And the key thing is that the one thing which I should have said earlier is, until 1980, performance is generally similar across states. The divergence that happens, the explosion, happens after 1980 and especially after 1991. Why? Essentially because there's much more political decentralization, much more policy decentralization, and much more fiscal decentralization over time. So basically, until 1980, you have this tall poppy syndrome, right? Uniform mediocrity, but once states have agency, some have exercised it much better than others have.
You also describe sort of what is happening almost like an internal aid model, the states that are doing better, giving more to the union. And there has obviously been complaints about that, and particularly I think in a time where the trust equation between the central government and the state governments, I think, has deteriorated. Right. You have more and more of those. Is that a fair, when you have some states coming out and saying, I'm sorry, but we're giving much more than we're getting, right, is that fair? What they're saying, is that fair? And do we need to change that?
Well, it is fair, but the states that are clamoring the most, that is unfair. So let me explain. So the broad thing, we know that for any large polity like India, which is a federal system, there will be parts of the country that are richer, parts of the country that are poorer. And a key aspect of nation building is to ensure that every citizen, whether she is in Kohima or in the Pune, has access to broadly comparable resources for health, education, meaning in terms of public resources. And that's why you get these transfers. That's part of fiscal federalism. So one of the things of nation building, and this chart sort of shows you, is that fiscal transfers to poorer states have been increasing over time. Unfortunately, we've got the wrong deck. But what we have, I think that's my mistake. Is that what we show is that, however, two things that have happened is, one is there has been a persistent rise, and you can see it here, to transfers to the Hindi heartland and also increasingly to Eastern Indian states. And there are what are called net aid receivers and net aid givers. But the maximum givers are not the southern states. It's the western states, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Haryana. So, but the clamor and saying this is unfair is coming most from the south. So what we say is that, look, this is probably because there are other issues now, language, for instance, etc., that are now being conflated. And so, the broad model of compromise, etc., that was critical for a federal system to work, there are more, stresses now.
So just to add to what Devesh said, see, on this whole fiscal federalism thing, I think in terms of pure fiscal transfers, as Devesh said, the southern states are not the biggest beneficiaries, donors. But the reason why the grievance is warranted is, or at least understandable, I'm not judging here, explainable, is the following. One is that, as Devesh said, all of us, all states are very comfortable with transferring some to the poorer states because we're part of a nation. The southern states and the western states also benefit from, the markets in the other states, the labor that comes from the other states. So, we shouldn't overlook that. However, if transfers keep rising and rising and rising, that is a problem. But even more importantly, they're rising and rising in the context of the fact that the beneficiaries are getting more and more despite consistent underperformance, and the richer states are transferring more and more despite overperformance. So the sense that the incentives here are very bad, and that's not sustainable. So both the rising transfers and the context of what the incentives they are creating is what explains the grievance.
Can I just, we don't have much time before we open the floor up, but this is something I want to know, as it's more in the background of the writing of this book. What were the points on which you both had the fiercest disagreements before you put words to paper and you sort of had debates which went on for a long time, and then you finally agreed on a form of words to be put into the book?
You want to be undiplomatic, or shall I be undiplomatic?
No, please be undiplomatic. Come on, this is not...
See, look, I think that any enterprise like this is going to have, authors disagreeing, right? But let me just say two or three things. One, that disagreement is almost necessary and essential because the book is much the better because of the disagreements and the things. But you can only have these disagreements in the context of a deeper underlying trust and commonality of broad convergence of views. Devesh and I agreed right from the start, and this is one of the distinctive aspects of the book, I'm not right, is that we don't think economic development is about, development is just about economics. It's about, Devesh has done a lot of work on the state in India. It's about society, it's about nation. So that comprehensive approach we shared. We also shared some ideas on the precociousness idea was something we shared. And above all, we shared we both obsess with data and its presentation. So even when we had disagreements, the arbiter would be not our egos, but the data.
Come on, you've got to tell me what you disagreed on. You've given me the preface to it, that this was our shared goal. But what were the points of disagreement before you settled?
No, I think, Devesh, you're being quiet here. Come on, you also need to speak up here. No, I think that I would say honestly that most of our disagreements maybe were about, style and presentation rather than substance. We had some disagreements on.
So just to tell you about one stylistic. So every chapter has an epigram at the beginning, right? It's a quote. So we put together the entire parliamentary transcripts over. That's about 0.7 billion words. And reading that, I didn't read 7.7 billion, but we read enormously. And we also put together about 3,000 official government committee reports. That is the basis of this book. Now, what we found was that in these parliamentary debates, not now, that's not the style anymore, but lots of parliamentarians or the committee authors would cite some Tamil poem, an Urdu couplet, a Sanskrit shlok, and it was very well, I mean, most of which that I was ignorant. So I wanted to pick some of those for the epigrams. Arvind is an incredible English literature aficionado. His thing was, we're putting Sanskrit, but we are totally ignorant about Sanskrit. So this is fake. You can't put in an epigram which you don't yourself understood until you saw it. So we went back and forth. But there's a last one, which I think we totally agreed. I think if you want to read it out to the audience, it's in the second last chapter.
Actually, it's the epigram. Yeah, and let me give full credit to Devesh for this one. And I must say, when I saw this, I said, this, although I will forever not forgive him for not allowing me to have one other quote, but I will not mention what that is. But this one is a really beautiful one. It's in our last chapter. And let me read, because I'm a South Indian, and therefore, हजारों ख्वाहिशें ऐसी कि हर ख्वाहिश पे दम निकले, बहुत निकले मेरे अरमान लेकिन फिर भी कम निकले. So basically it's saying thousands of longings, each to die for, many fulfilled, yet so few fulfilled. To be fair so Devesh gets the credit for the quote, but he's been very generous in saying, wow, what a translation from a South Indian.
So anyway, I have failed at my khwahish because I was trying to get you both to talk about points of contention, which you very cleverly avoided telling me, but that's fine. We've got 5 minutes to go before you all get to ask questions. So I want to sort of, and is that the last chapter or the second last chapter?
It's a penultimate chapter because it's the looking back chapter. Then there's a looking ahead chapter.
Which is about 5 pages.
So I think a lot of people are going to be thinking, okay, we're going to get loads of solutions in this book. What should India do after this? But that's not the case. You've actually avoided doing that. You have given one broad piece of advice. Yes, so firstly, if you could tell me why you don't want to give a list of things that India should do. And the second thing is, what is that broad piece of advice?
So actually, in 2019, when you had that general elections, we had actually written a 100-page. It really worked hard on recommendations on reforms
before the 2019 elections,
and then we completely scrapped it. We junked it. So part of the reason is, look, as we show in the book, many of the challenges and the solutions, we have nothing new that we are saying. I mean, over here, but where we will all differ is the ranking. Should he reform the courts first? Should he reform the police? Should he reform election finance? Everyone broadly knows, should people with criminal cases be allowed to, go to things? How do you have to do for agriculture? Look at pollution. You can go down and, you'll have your 3, I'll have my 3, he'll have his 3. So we just didn't think it would be original. So we converged and saying, we are just going to give one recommendation, which is the equivalent of the doctor's Hippocratic oath, do no harm. Because we think that we are both underappreciating the enormous gains or what India achieved in nation and state building, but we also underestimate how fragile that is, not just in India, but anywhere in the world. Therefore, sometimes you get an Amazon package which has a glass of it. It'll say, fragile, handle with care. It's in that spirit that we said, think about your politics, winning elections, next one. Yes, that's important, but be careful.
So just to add two things to what Devesh said. See, another reason not to be overly prescriptive is one of the things that we learned from writing the book, the retrospective gaze over 75 years. If you look at the major changes that have occurred, really, truly major changes, not the, idly-fiddly changes, they've come about either through crisis. 1991, everything changed. After the 1966 crisis, the whole turn towards the agricultural revolution happened. So crises were a big part, and you cannot say, as a recommendation, let's have a crisis. Although once a crisis happens, you can say, let's take advantage of it. You can't say, let's have a crisis. The second major force for change is technology. It's also exogenous. The whole telecommunications revolution doesn't happen without technology. I think the third thing which we found, which was actually the biggest surprise to us, is how much economic growth after 1980 itself led to a lot of change. Just to give you one example, we've done very poorly on education generally. But after 1990, especially the late 1990s, our educational outcomes have improved to some extent because economic growth both provided the resources for the state to spend much more, which did happen, and also because the returns to education went up. Parents said, we want more education. And if they didn't get it in the public sector, they would go to private schools. So these were the three major forces for change. And so you cannot say, if you say, crisis, it's silly. Technology, silly, it's exogenous. Three, if you say get growth, but then people say, how do you get growth? And you're back to the thing. The second thing I would say, just to add to the thing about the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm, is, as Devesh said, if you look around, the neighborhood, every country, major instability. If you look across the world, Nigeria, Sudan, the former Soviet Union, the former Yugoslavia, Ethiopia, Nigeria closed, they've actually not even survived as nations, And so it's a very fragile thing which we need to understand and preserve. But I think the last thing I would say is that going forward, one particular aspect that I think we really need to pay attention to and not squander is the trust between the center and the states. Everything that India needs to do going forward, whatever the challenge, air pollution in Delhi, it has to be done between the center and all the states therein. GST, center and states. Power sector reform, center and states. So all the challenges, and if we lose that basic trust between the center and the states, I think all our challenges will be that much more difficult to overcome. So do no harm on all these wonderful achievements we've had.
All right, so it's time for you all to ask your questions. I think, do we have a microphone in the, oh, okay. All right, okay, I'm going to start. His hand went up first. Oh, so if the mic is right behind you, sir. If you could please introduce yourself and then ask a question.
I'm Mudit Jain, a businessman, and thanks for your insights. My question is, we can always torture metrics to suit our requirements, so I'm also torturing it. If you look at the people who have left India for better shores, that is a good metric. They didn't have confidence in their own country. And if you compare it with other countries, you would get some kind of validation for why they left. And also, even in the World Committee of Nations, if you see now, per capita income is a very, a strong yardstick, plus the World Economic Forum's, HDI, Human Development Index. India ranks poorly in all these. And it all comes down to poor governance, if you ask me. So you have compared within India, Tamil Nadu growth rate being like China, but there's a world of difference between China and Tamil Nadu. If you can just give your comments.
No, so we very much in the book have a comparative approach. I mean, unfortunately, the slide deck that is here doesn't have those slides, but we absolutely have three comparisons throughout the book. One is over time, the second is across states, the third is India compared to other comparable countries, and there we compare over what we call chronological time, but also what we call development time. If you want to compare India with the US, the Indian state with the US, there's no point in comparing India at this per capita income with the US. But it does have a way to compare India with the US when the US had a similar per capita income, which is about a century ago. So we have in the book throughout these four comparisons, and unfortunately we could have shown those charts, but there's a slight thing.
So can I just a different way of saying what Devesh said is, there's a famous joke, the economist turns to the economist's wife turns to the economist and says, "Honey, do you love me?" And he says, "Relative to what?" And therefore, and what Devesh is saying that, because just one thing, while there's no doubt that people leaving is a sign of whatever, many more people have left the country after 1980 than before. But I mean, India in 2025 and India in 1980 are completely different. I think we also have to acknowledge that there's been huge progress. I mean, you look at the Bombay skyline over the last 5 years and compare. So I mean, that's why there's some things are going right. And also, I mean, let's not forget what Devesh and I have been saying, those great achievements of nation building, etc. It's true that some of them are under threat now, but I don't think we should allow. Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. I'm Nari Godrej. Two quick questions. First, you mentioned India's budget deficit was the highest in the world. My question regarding that is, should we also look at debt to GDP and maybe even for a country like India, debt to government assets, and would that give us more comfort? And the second question is, you mentioned that state and center need to cooperate, and you were instrumental in the GST. That's an excellent example of state and center cooperation. Can we use the GST kind of governance model to get more state and center cooperation?
So Dr. Kapur is suggesting that we take a few questions and then we can answer them. So go ahead.
Siddhant Damani, I'm an associate partner with Booz & Company. The recent bull run has created a lot of wealth and polarization. The asset ownership has gotten more skewed. As we comment upon the federal and the state structure, at an individual level, how do you see it play out, given how it has played out for other countries, probably, and the people there?
Should we take one more and then perhaps you can answer? If we can get the gentleman there a microphone.
Thank you, firstly, for a brilliant dissertation. You started off talking about inflation and India's growth without violence. The evil the Western world has imposed upon the world is the letting out the inflation genie out of the bottle. And what it's created, as we've seen, is huge disparity, disjoint, and in many cases, civil unrest. And someone mentioned earlier, debt to GDP ratios being a big issue. As India grows, inevitably it'll be importing that inflation. How does India expect to deal with that when it has a large amount of debt itself?
Could I just ask you to introduce yourself and what you do?
My name is Suren. I'm from Australia. I'm a fund manager and just partnered with fellow fund managers in India.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, so you take the start. Okay, so thanks for great questions. I'll take the first and the third, and Devesh will take the second one. So when we look at the fiscal situation, absolutely, we also in the book discuss about debt to GDP ratios, which you have to look at. And as I said earlier, the reason why debt to GDP in India at this stage doesn't look very bad is because we're growing. You know, the denominator is doing well. So as long as we're growing, debt to GDP will be sustainable. The problem is, if you have very high fiscal deficits, what it will take you to get onto an unsustainable path, those triggers are much more fragile. So you grow, debt is sustainable, but because you have high fiscal deficits, some trigger and that goes off kilter very quickly, and that's why we should address our fiscal situation. And that's partly also a response to your question as well, that, yes, we need to, I think you have a view, the Woodford view of the world where, inflation is determined by debt. And I think we can, if we can do the right things, if we can grow and we can cut these deficits, I think that's not a problem as much. Your second question, you see, on the structures, for GST, you're absolutely right. Excellent thing. But we have these structures for cooperation. And Devesh can speak much more. We have the National Development Council. We have all kinds of things. Interstate council. So the problem is not having the structures. The problem is, do we have the kind of leadership that will, actually do this? And this requires that underlying trust between the center and the states. You don't have the trust, no amount of structures can help. And if you have the trust, then maybe, things will be much easier to resolve.
So the question on sort of wealth that you had. So in the book, and also to answer your question about inequality. So the usual ways we think about inequality, one is around wealth, other is around income, and often, especially in India, because of lack of good measures on the first two, we use consumption, so inequality. Now, what we show in the book is there are lots of debates how you measure, etc. So we use one very simple metric, which is the number of billionaires relative to a country's per capita income. And we show that India here too is an outlier. It has vastly more billionaires relative to its relative, income compared to Germany, France, China, US, all those countries, which is a very good indicator that there is huge wealth concentration happening at the top. However, I think we should not just take the Western ways of looking at inequality. In India's case, intergroup inequality and intra-household inequality are extremely important. Intra-household is, of course, gender, and we can talk about it. On the intergroup inequality, we show that there is broad, on a range, not on every indicator, but on a range of indicators, that is a trend towards convergence towards the upper caste from the OBCs and the Dalits, the scheduled caste. However, in the case of Muslims and in the case of Adivasis, the central Indian belt, that is not happening.
And I think his question, the question he asked there. Oh, sorry. Do you remember the question? Do you want him to repeat it?
I think, I'm surprised you asked this. We're in a Goldilocks period on inflation where, we have very low inflation. See, I think imported inflation in India is going to be less of an issue than if we have good agriculture in India, one. I think our inflation will generally be under control. And second is we have to keep our, deficits under control, broadly. And if you have broadly those two things, I think we should, our inflation thing should be reasonably okay. Because as I said, remember, Indian society wants low inflation.
But just to add, Arvind, in the past, India's imported inflation came generally because of increases in oil prices, because India was such a large energy importer. But I think, I'm hardly an expert, but the general thing is that oil prices are not going to skyrocket to anything of the degree that we've seen in the past. So that key source of importing inflation is unlikely.
But I think what he had in mind is more the reckless, capital. That I think it's mostly more domestic than international is what.
So I think we've got one question here and one question there. I think we only have time for two more, if I'm honest. But I hope they might be available afterwards, and perhaps you can meet them in person and ask them that. Go ahead.
Are we going to sign books if you...
Oh, yes, and I also, I think Mr. Mehta already said that at the beginning, that there are books available and the authors are here, so you can, I need to get mine signed as well, please. So can you go ahead with your question? We'll take your question, and then everybody else, if I could just request you to catch them afterwards.
Thank you. I'm Suketu Shah.
You have a question. Okay.
I'm also a business person. I'm not sure if you really answered this question. Maybe you referred to it a little bit. But in a society where the fault lines within society, whether it's caste or whether it is religion or other divides that are there, and those are sort of worked actively to be exacerbated, and it's happening in the United States, it's happening in many other countries. What do you feel is the impact of that on economic growth?
And can we take one more question?
Sure. My name is Milap, and I'm a Silicon Valley tech and AI entrepreneur. So perhaps I'm part of the problem. What will be the impact in a mercantilistic world where exports certainly are challenged and AI comes in? Or how do the authors see that affect the future prospects, as it were, for India?
Sorry, we're going to take one more question. Is there a woman who had her hand up? Yes, please. Can we get the microphone to her? That should have been me noticing it, but I'm glad that you did.
Thanks, Devesh. I'm Preeta Venkatachalam. I'm at the Britspan Group. We're a global impact advisory organization. So my question really is about, you spoke about crisis and technology and not going down that road. But how about just innovation and India's competitive advantage in the world? Because sadly, some of the biggest things we are known for, right? And it is interesting, the surprise on the low-cost manufacturing, because where we have made a mark are things like IT-enabled services, generics, now vaccines, more so post-COVID, and all of which are branded as kind of more the low-cost advantage of India or the labor cost advantage. But is there actually an innovation angle that India's maybe hidden secret that you think can be one of the development paradigms that we can take off on? And of course, I do know the flip side, we invest much lesser in R&D. So how do you kind of marry that dissonance?
So your point on social cleavages and how that might impact economic growth. So the way historically that social cleavages affect economic growth is civil unrest. You have violence, you have strikes. That's one mechanism. The second is, take one, social cleavage, say around gender. If half your population is not part of the growth story, it doesn't take that much to realize your growth is going to be so impaired. The Muslims are about 1/6 of the population. If we do not get them fully on board, well, it's like having a 6-cylinder engine car and one cylinder is not working. So just as an arithmetic factor, if large sections of the population are not part of the growth story, that will pull your growth down, I think, just as a... And then, of course, there are the political risks begin to multiply. It's much harder to get agreement on things. And if it goes even further, I think you risk at least that unrest might rise. Look how we treated the Adivasis for so long, and you got a Maoist movement in central India for 40 years that has led to tens of thousands of lives being destroyed, and the region has been extremely underdeveloped. So you see a consequence of that cleavage. I think I'll just take the innovation one. So I think I might slightly disagree with you. I think we are really not anywhere realizing how much innovation matters. So the World Bank has an annual flagship publication called the World Development Report. I led I was the academic lead for the one that came out a few weeks ago. It's on standards like for development. And you see just how much East Asian countries focused on standards as a way to achieve so many positive outcomes. In India, it's hardly a thing. You talked about low R&D spending, and I know many of you are from the private sector. It is frankly not very gratifying to say that India is a complete outlier in how low the private sector spends on. Look at our two largest groups, the Ambanis and the Adanis. Look at how many patents they file compared to the Samsungs. Look at their R&D efforts. And so because that intense competitiveness, as in China, that drives innovation, that is still not a major driver here.
So just, I was thrown by your linking AI to mercantilism, which I couldn't quite see, because there's a whole mercantilist threat to India because of China, because of the way China is being mercantilist. But I guess that's not what you had in mind. Sorry?
The traditional growth methods, exporting your way through growth, and job creation through higher value addition, both are under threat for India. If I look at the job displacement potential of AI and the fact that we can know.
Yeah, so let me address those. So on the first one, it is true that going forward, even all the labor-intensive industries that we do will employ less labor than in the past. No question about that. You take China, the robots are doing things with apparel that never used to happen. However, it is nevertheless a mistake to conclude that therefore that avenue is gone because of the following simple numbers. China, let's say, occupies 50% of the global export market share in labor intensive. We have 3%. We will never go to 30%, 40%. But there's no reason why, as China's share comes down, as it will have to over time, why we can't raise it from 3 to say 11, 12, 13, 14%. Because even with the lower employment potential, will offer a lot of job opportunities for India. And this is not theoretical. If you look at Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh, those electronic components, the non-leather footwear, factories are employing, unlike in the past, 20, 30, 40,000, mainly women coming and living. So that opportunity is not gone. So we shouldn't foreclose that just because we think the employment. AI, I think, I don't want to get too much into it, but AI is both a threat, but also there's a lot of potential in this. If you read, there's a person called Dan Wang who writes on China. I would recommend very highly. He has a new book on China called Breakneck, and he has an annual letter that he writes, which is written. He says, I think it also relates a bit to your question that, AI, if you can learn to use AI effectively, and the uses are enormous. Learning, you can use AI. Agriculture, you can use AI. So as long as you're geared to use AI effectively, then, it can counterbalance some of the threats that can happen. The last thing I'll say on your question is that a fundamental tenet of economics is, or actually development is, without order, there is no development. And if you have polarization in the long run, even that order will be compromised. So in the long run, any polarization, etc., that happens is going to be bad for long-run economic development.
Mr. Mehta, you have a question, or you want me to hand back to you? So just give me a minute. Yeah. So firstly, I just want to say thank you so much. The book, as I said, for me, it has been an education. I'll keep going back to it, and it's really hard nowadays to find books that are really just rooted in the data and in the numbers. So thank you so much for that. I can imagine how many years and how much work and how much rigor has gone into it. Thank you to Mr. Mehta for your kind words, and to Asia Society for It's been a real privilege for me. And sorry, I have you as a captive audience, so I am gonna say something, because we talk about holding on to democracy at the end of your book. In a week from now, people who are registered to vote in Mumbai, we're going to be voting for a much delayed corporation election. We can debate about whether it's a good model of governance or not, but it's the only one we have as of now. So I hope everyone is looking up where they have to go and cast their vote, and I hope you're going to do that in a week from now. So thank you very much, and with that, I'll hand back to Mr. Modi.
No, don't go away, I have a question. Before I say thank you, I'm taking the liberty of asking a question, and it's actually in two parts. We speak about democratic institutions and how we can facilitate growth. Somewhere in our DNA, in our India's democracy, and maybe it's in other democracies as well, we've never really focused on accountability. And I think if you don't hold people accountable, they're not worth sort of the liberty that they want in democracy. And that is an impediment for our growth in all spheres. People die with potholes, water, there's accidents, no civic authority is held accountable for anybody, no individual is held accountable. How do we build accountability in a democracy where we are really responsible for our actions or our inactions? That's number one. Number two is also the whole aspect of regulatory architecture, because if we don't have a contemporary regulatory architecture in line with whatever the world is changing, the markets are getting sophisticated, social norms are getting different. How do we sort of build a much more robust economic growth? Two questions.
Do you want to take the first one, maybe? Take the regulatory. Because you've got lots of regulation.
Yes, so I'll try and answer your second one through a historical example, So I think some of you have heard the words Inspector Raj. There was the License Raj, there was Inspector Raj. The Inspector Raj, the roots of that is the Indian Boilers Act of 1923. Now, in this World Development Report, so every industrial revolution now with AI brings risks. The first industrial revolution, the big risk, which was the steam, the boilers would explode. France and Britain took diametrically opposite ways of regulating boiler operators. France, being France, said the National Science Academy will come up with the thickness of the boiler, the safety valve, all of that. Britain used the insurance route. There's a liability, so the insurance company it has to pay out, so it will do the inspections. Boilers explosions went down far more sharply in Britain than in France. However, because insurance has a premium, fewer British boiler owners bought insurance, so the average was the same. When Britain passed, if you see the first page of the Act, I'm probably one of 5 people who has read the Act, it says, in Britain we used insurance. In India, however, insurance will not work. They don't specify why. So we will have to go for state inspection. In the state of Karnataka, I don't have the exact numbers, there are about 10,000 boilers, I believe 3 inspectors. Now, it's an example of saying that, look, there are mechanisms outside regulation that you can use things like insurance. You don't have to have, state inspection to achieve and create the incentives to achieve the same outcomes. So it requires a degree of creativity to look for solutions and not just say how we can improve the Inspector Raj. I'm just using it as an illustration.
Your first question is a, very deep difficult and we can argue for things. But just say 2 or 3 things, very simple things. I think you chose your question very carefully. I think democracy and accountability are 2 distinct things. In India, we tend to overburden democracy with the accountability function, but just happens, most of the accountability happens in between elections, and so we need mechanisms in between elections to build accountability. And democracy has been much more about accommodation, representation, a sense of worth, equality, etc. But I mean, that's true world over. Democracy has never been, just electoral democracy or elections are not the mechanism for accountability. It has to be much more. The second thing, and because I want to keep it brief, is that we too often think that the state, we want to reform somehow the state to increase accountability. Many, many of the outcomes that we see, whether on health, education, sanitation, etc., we, society, are deeply implicated in that. And when they say, oh, I've seen the enemy and it is us, I think we recognize the importance of how much society. And the reason I'm saying this is because, the solutions are not easy, because how do you reform society? But just as perspective, when we talk about accountability, it's not just about what the state can do, but what we as society have to do as well.
My really convergence is on that point, that how much is it that we take responsibility ourselves and be accountable for whatever actions as part of this democracy, because there's no point being critical of others. As they say that you can throw stones, but there's no one to catch them with the other.
Sorry, can I just to give a brief example? I was talking with a very famous journalist in Delhi. In Delhi, every resident welfare association, RWA, mimics all the pathologies. There's no state there. It mimics all the pathologies of the Indian state. Nepotism, corruption, lack of accountability. You go to fighting, infighting. So in some ways, that's a microcosm of Indian society as a whole. So I think that's a perspective to keep in mind.
We can continue with this dialogue and this conversation. There's so much to talk about. But unfortunately, we have limitation of time, and I can see people are getting restless to go home. But
restless to buy the book.
And to buy the book, of course. There's so much in this book. Thank you. But thank you, all of you, Arvind, Devesh, and Yogita, for a remarkable conversation. It was, I think, truly fun being here and listening to all of you, and listening to the wonderful audience and their wonderful questions. So thank you all, and greatly appreciate you being present here this evening. Asia Society continues to be the one that likes these to come up with all these dialogues, and your presence really makes the difference. So thank you all for coming in. And a special thanks to Jolly and to the Asia Society team. So let's give them a round of applause. And the best part is, even without Inakshi being present here, I think you've done a remarkable job. But thank Inakshi for organizing all of this, and thank you all for being here. Thank you.